Well, thank you very much. As I was sitting there watching, I noticed our lawyers, as lawyers are wont to do, were making notes. And so I thought before we open this up to you, I would ask them if perhaps Bonnie's remarks had triggered things that they just had to say. We were joking before all this started about having the chance to speak last is a big deal for lawyers. So,
I can start because I'm not afraid to go after somebody. But in doing so, I'm also going to be starting out with saying that there's something that I agree with significantly that Professor Mann had indicated. And she was positing the question essentially about how does our dim view as a society of child abuse, particularly abuse by a mother, in fact perpetuate abuse. And I in fact wholeheartedly agree with that because of the social stigma that's attached to abusive trauma. It's difficult for any parent, including a mother, I think sometimes to reach out for outside help under those circumstances when they are abusing a child or neglecting a child in an intimate area, like behind closed doors, because they realize they're going to be judged for the conduct that they've already engaged in as a result of that. So I think that does present a barrier because people would not be accepting of it, and I think people understand just the judgmental human nature that if they tried to reach a hand out or reach for a hand and say, "Can you help me out? I'm, poking my child with needles and locking them in a closet all night long." They're fearing that they're not just going to get help. They're going to get their child taken away from them. They're going to be viewed as a horrible parent and a complete failure of their one primary role in life, at least that seems to be universally viewed as a mother being responsible for the care and nurturing of the child. And so I do see that. I do see that time after time. As I indicated, I don't just try homicide cases. I'm reviewing child abuse cases consistently, and there's a big spectrum of types of neglect and abuse that happen. But I do see that as a very significant impediment to a mother reaching out to outside help, to third-party help. However, where I also see that lands perhaps in a different perspective from something that Professor Mann had indicated is that in particular with the McAnulty case, indicating that we kind of isolate the mother and we don't punish the rest of the family, we don't punish the absentee father. I can tell you I certainly, from a moral standpoint, have my own views on the role of the absentee father in this, and understanding that he has sought legal counsel to sue the state to recover financially for the loss of his daughter. And I will say here that the views of Eric Hasselman do not necessarily reflect the views of the district attorney's office as a whole. But I think it's shocking. I think it's for him to profit when he has been incarcerated for a good portion of then Jeanette's life for his selfish choices, and then for a decade didn't make any apparent effort to be part of her life, to be part of her child rearing. It seems inequitable to reward him financially for her death. But that's aside. The point was that Angela McAnulty was isolated in her extreme role as a mother who bears all the responsibility, and remind you that there was another adult in the house, the stepfather, who by all accounts contributed but not significantly to the cause of the child's death. The investigation tended to substantiate that the mother was predominantly responsible for the roles. But we looked at his role in his accessory and his failure to act on or his omission of acting in his duty as a care provider within the household to saving the child as very serious as well, and he's been sentenced to a term of life imprisonment for his role. As far as the external people go, That's more from our standpoint. They're not covered in the law, and that may be a complaint or at least an observation that Professor Mann is making, that we don't hold a greater, on a grander scale, more people responsible, and that may be right or wrong, but I just wanted to bring up the point that we didn't just isolate the mother. We certainly isolated her prosecution as being the one that would potentially bear the highest penalty, but that was just factually based on her role in the crimes against her daughter, and also the fact that there had been times that both other people and the state had reached out. Her parental rights to her Jeanette's two brothers, older brothers, had been terminated, and a court in California, after Angela McAnulty had had another daughter and begged for them to give Jeanette back to her, the judge made a judgment call and in fact gave her the daughter back, who soon after that started becoming the victim of fairly significant abuse at a very young age, despite having been removed from her house, from Angela McAnulty's household for a period of years and living in foster care. And so efforts were made on the outside, and of course that dynamic leads to a different discussion of why would this mother, when she's not coping with dealing with this child, beg for her to come back. And I think that does get back into some of the motivations that our society has put culturally on mothers to do the most they can to be involved in their child's life, even if they're ill-equipped to do that. So those are at least comments that I have.
Okay, do we have any questions or comments? Yes.
I think it's interesting how, I think what Professor Mann points out is what we talk about is we talk about the individual and the state, and I think that there's something in between the individual and the state that's missing. When we say that the mother needs to reach out, it's again, the onus is on her, and our remedy right now is that the state is who reaches out. I think there's a communal aspect that's outside of our culture right now that we don't know how to address, how the individual mother, we only know how to address the state interventions or the complete onus on an individual. And I think that that's where that extreme burden and responsibility becomes so dangerous, because we don't know how to interject ourselves into what we see as like the private and the individual. And we only see that there's the public and then there's the private, and family falls into the private, and we don't know how to deal with that.
For the sake of the tape, let me sort of briefly repeat that. Our audience member says that as things have been presented, there's the extremes of the individual and the state, and there's nothing in between. And she's suggesting that there should be something in between, some kind of communal responsibility, some kind of communal way of acting, but we don't have a good way of invoking that, or it may not even exist, and so that's a big lack in sort of dealing with this whole issue. Anybody want to comment on that?
I think you're right, and that has to do with the evolution of society too. I mean, traditionally, in the past, certainly in Western culture, organized church and religion played a big responsibility in people's family relationships, because it was such a big part of people actually, a community interacting. I think we've gone away from that, and I put no value judgment on that, but now we put that responsibility on a state. And when we're talking about the state, I call myself the state, but obviously we have different branches of governmental agencies that deal with child protective issues. My role is prosecution, but child welfare is ill-equipped to have the resources, obviously, to deal with overseeing the parenting of children, and the status quo is we assume children are being raised adequately until we're informed otherwise. And I think that's what you're saying, is maybe that's not working for us, because there certainly are indications that we don't catch everybody, and we do have case after case of these failings in children being protected. But I don't know. I think if that were an easy answer on how to solve that, it would have been solved already.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, it seems to me that the school has been in the past part of that halfway position, and that school people have picked up on problems, have provided extra support, have filled in many places, and they can do that so little now because they are stretched so thin, where there used to be redundancy in the system. A teacher could talk with a child after school or provide special nurturing or whatever. That's really not possible anymore. Or it's possible only at great sacrifice to the teacher, similar to the sacrifice you're talking about a mother making. So it seems like a second system is falling by the wayside, which is providing greater stress.
Let me say two things. One is, I think, when we look at this problem legally, we tend to look at it as a problem after the harm has occurred, right? Because we're talking about punishment, prosecution. When we look at it in a moral sense or a broader social sense, I think we've also started to take that mentality into these other spheres. So I'm thinking about what happened when, I think it was Nebraska, that had this, they opened up their, what is it called, the law that where you can bring your baby to a safe space and
Safe haven.
safe haven laws. So they opened that up to children all the way to 18. What happened?
On accident. They didn't mean to do it, they were shocked.
But what happened? You had parents coming from all over the place from other states to leave their children. And these parents were, again, roundly condemned for that action. However, when I think of Angela McAnulty, the thing that just kills me is, why didn't she walk away? It would have been so much better to abandon that child and let someone else step in. But again, that social condemnation for someone who does make that choice, it's never seen as a responsible choice, unless it's a teenage birth mom who's putting her child out for adoption, then maybe, but it's never seen as a responsible choice.
Well, Joe, I have a question. Oh, okay. Joe, I have a question for you. You're saying, oh, mothers always get off so easy, but isn't it true that it's really, really, really rare for any kind of insanity or automatism defense to work? I mean, we don't acquit mothers, even in the cases, there are some of these cases that have come out of the South where the women really did have diagnosed major mental disorders. I mean, they were really seriously mentally ill, and they still got convicted. Maybe they weren't convicted of aggravated murder, but they were still convicted. So I'm not so
apparently,
sure.
unless you're a 50-year-old medical doctor in Urbana.
Right, I did notice
Illinois.
that class issue. Yes, the class issue of the 50-year-old medical doctor who got acquitted. But absent that, we don't let these people off.
Yeah, when I say leniency, I'm really talking mitigation, and I'm talking manslaughter, something like that. Not talking a full acquittal. Well, that's why the case out of Florida was pretty unusual. This recent one, Anthony, I think is her name, Casey.
Well, they just
Anthony,
couldn't find the kid.
Yeah. It just strikes me as a pretty unusual verdict in which the jury did say as to she was convicted of other lying, but not guilty is on them straight up, and that was pretty unusual. I think most of the time we see, oh, she avoided the death penalty, she avoided a first-degree murder conviction, but was convicted of manslaughter or some other similar crime.
Meredith.
I've been doing a little bit of research on the hate killing cases, and I noticed that in the past, both parents have been charged with what manslaughter or murder homicide, but there are obviously cases where they fail to act, it's not abuse, and the fathers have been convicted, but the mothers have been let off, which is not true of the most recent cases. But I was wondering if any of you have perspective on whether that's common in sort of failure to care cases that fathers are blamed more than mothers.
Let me repeat that. The question is in many of the faith healing cases where the parents fail to provide medical care and the child dies, the fathers, most of the responsibility, the criminal responsibility is put on the fathers. The fathers are convicted, the mothers are acquitted, or the fathers are convicted of more serious crimes than than the mothers, and she asked whether that is a general pattern in failure to care for kinds of cases rather than the physical abuse cases.
I have an answer I can suggest. A lot of that, again, in those faith healing cases, you have to remember that some religions are more patriarchal, and the factual evidence, as I understand it, that have come out in some of those cases is that the father called all the shots. The mother was in a submissive role within her marriage, and when the father said, "We're not getting medical care for the child," even though neither the father nor the mother sought medical care, people understood that situation and were more inclined to not hold the mother criminally responsible for the decision to withhold medical care for the child as the father, who was exercising his dominance within the relationship in those cases. And that's not always the case. And I think juries, it's going to be very fact dependent whether or not, as Joe said, if you can get the prosecutor to buy off in the first place and avoid charges to even be considered by a jury, that's great. And I think there have been some of those situations where the state has actually sought to punish one parent instead of the other, or at the exclusion of the other. But even in cases where they've gone after both parents out of some, it would appear some sense of fairness, factually, if a trier of fact is not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the mother was in a position to have influenced this decision, then the decision may be accordingly by either a judge or jury.
Question: if you have a situation where there's no neglect or abuse of the child by either parent, all indications from everybody that knows the family is that the child was extremely loved and well cared for, but then there's a very sudden onset of severe mental illness on the part of the mother, and she kills the child, and it seems clear from family history that it was mental illness. Do you have, in situations like that, does this usually go to a plea bargain situation, or does it, and if so, are we looking at manslaughter rather than murder? Are we looking at not guilty by reason of insanity and then admission to the state hospital? What's the normal outcome?
It's a good question. The question was, when there is pretty clear evidence of a mental break, psychotic break, where does a case end up, trial or plea? In my experience, that if there truly is, and I have had cases where there is, both sides of an agreement that the individual was floored, that was not, was legally insane at the time, then you're going to reach some agreement. I expect you don't need to go, you reach an agreement with the prosecution. Is that your experience? It's my experience as well. And just for your edification, in Oregon, we don't have not guilty by reason of insanity. We actually have changed that nomenclature to guilty but insane, or guilty except for insanity. And so they're not being adjudicated, being acquitted in that sense. They're being found guilty and responsible, but under a different, they're going to go in a different direction. They're going to be under the jurisdiction of the Psychiatric Security Review Board rather than the Department of Corrections in a traditional punishment sense. But we have cases all the time. In fact, more so in the last few years, from my standpoint, of family members, not parents killing children, but children killing parents or children killing grandparents. I had 2 stabbing cases in the last 5 years, a girl who stabbed her grandmother to death and a son who stabbed his father to death, both of which were resolved up front with guilty except for insanity pleas, and they were because of identifiable, trackable mental illness that both sides agreed existed and was the cause of, or at least the cause of the person's responsibility for the offense.
I have some very brief follow-up question.
Just a second, I'm sorry, we're just about out of time, and I want to let one more person. Professor Weiner, what was your question?
I wanted to make one comment and then I have one question. So my comment was just directed to the statistics on the disparity, the gender disparity. What I understand is some of that disparity is attributable to differences in prior records, and that that's taken into account, and some of that goes with it. In any event, I guess my question is directed to Professor Mann, and I was wondering to what extent you think this idea of the image of mothering contributing to this problem is linked to the mothering being done by women. And what I mean by that is, as you hear, I think, and see a change, maybe the willingness to mother by men, whether or not that problem is going to get better or worse or stay the same. Is it a private-public kind of divide problem more than a gender problem? Or I guess I was wondering how you see gender in something like that.
Yeah, I would briefly repeat the question.
Okay, so the question is whether the primary dynamic in this idealization of motherhood has to do with motherhood being a gendered activity, and whether as men take on mothering more and more, there might be some shift in those sort of symbolic levels where we deal with idealizations and demonizations of mothering persons. So I think that's a great question. I don't think we know yet, because I think that even as more men have taken on mothering activities, there's very little written about or thought about men taking on mothering activities. I think it's too new for us to know. One thing I think we will find is that men who take on mothering activities, and particularly if they become isolated in those activities, are going to experience those same kinds of horrendous urges to hurt and kill their children in the same kinds of circumstances, and will be fighting that ethical battle that mothers have traditionally fought. Whether they will be able to make that struggle public in the way that women have, kept that private, kept that very taboo, I'm not sure, but I would hope that things would shift. I do think that now gender is a primary dynamic. I don't think it has to be.
So please join me in thanking our speakers. We got a good